A team of archaeologists at the University of Oregon have found one of North America's oldest human-occupied sites in southern Oregon.
Every textbook says humans arrived in North America around 13,000 years ago. A shallow rock shelter in the Oregon desert just proved that wrong by 7,000 years. In 2012, archaeologists pulled a camel tooth from beneath a sealed layer of volcanic ash. And when radiocarbon dating came back at 18,250 years, the room went quiet. The tooth carried cut marks from stone tools. I thought, holy smokes, we've got 15,800 as a date for the ash. We have teeth fragments underneath that turn out to be camel. And below that we have a tool that's, probably over 18 and deeper than the ass. Human tools used to butcher an animal that went extinct thousands of years before anyone was supposed to be here. That alone should have been impossible. But then the team looked deeper beneath the tooth, beneath the ash, into layers that no one had touched and found more tools. Older tools. This was the one, the tool, the orange-agat multi-tool, music, I call the Leatherman, the prehistoric Leatherman that was found down below the St. Helens SG ash that dates to 15,800 years ago. And the reason I call it a multi-tool is because it has a cutting edge right here. Evidence that pushes human presence at this site back to 20,000 years ago during the last glacial maximum when ice sheets smothered the continent, and the migration route humans supposedly used didn't even exist yet. This discovery hasn't been retracted. It hasn't been debunked, and it changes the timeline of music, human existence. The shelter nobody cared about. Picture this. A flat wind-scorched expanse of high desert in Harney County, Oregon. The sun hits the basalt so hard the air above it shimmers. Sagebrush as far as you can see. And tucked into a low ridge barely noticeable unless you're standing right in front of it. A shallow overhang of rock. 20 m long, 3 m deep. Not a cave, not dramatic, just a dip in the landscape where the wind doesn't reach. That's Rimrock Draw rock shelter. And for most of the last century, nobody gave it a second thought. Here's the catch. According to the Clovis first model, the theory that dominated American archaeology for nearly 100 years, humans didn't set foot in North America until about 13,000 years ago. They walked from Siberia across a land bridge, pushed south through an ice-free corridor between two massive glaciers and spread across the continent, carrying distinctive fluted stone tools. Neat story, clean, simple, and it turned this entire region into a blank spot on the map. Too cold, too dry, too remote to matter. Rimrock Draw didn't exist in that story. It wasn't worth a second look. So when archaeologist Patrick O'Grady from the University of Oregon started digging here in 2011, he wasn't trying to rewrite anything. The project was modest, a partnership with the Bureau of Land Management to study Ice Age animal remains and environmental changes. Safe work, predictable work. O'Grady had spent years doing field work in the Great Basin region. He knew the desert. He knew what to expect from shallow shelters and volcanic terrain. It had been a great season, and we hadn't found anything that was really exceptional. We found some stone tools and things that were interesting. You dig down, you find some late-period artifacts, you catalog them, you publish a quiet paper. That was the plan. But the ground had other plans. From the first test excavation, something felt different. The sediment layers inside the shelter were pristine, not churned up by burrowing animals or washed downward by water or tangled with root intrusions. The usual mess you find in open shelters exposed to thousands of years of weather. These layers were flat, sharp, perfectly stacked, each one sitting exactly where it had formed. Some of them thousands of years ago. Dark bands showed periods of activity. Lighter bands showed gaps. And the deeper O'Gray's team went, the older the layers became, following every rule of geological superposition without a single exception. In field archaeology, this kind of preservation is rare enough to make experienced researchers stop what they're doing and slow down. The ground was talking, and what it was saying didn't match the story. And get this, stone tools started appearing. Not scattered randomly, not washed in from somewhere else. They showed up at specific depths, locked inside specific layers, separated by centuries of empty sediment. People had come here, left, come back, left again, over and over. This wasn't a campsite someone stumbled into once. It was a destination. A destination that, according to the Clovis timeline, should not have existed. Then the team cracked through a layer sealed beneath volcanic ash and found something that turned discomfort into devastation. The tooth that broke the timeline. The ash was from Mount St. Helens, not the famous 1980 eruption. A far older one, independently dated by geologists to more than 15,600 years ago. Volcanic ash is one of the most reliable time markers in archaeology. It spreads fast, settles evenly, and once it's down, anything beneath it is sealed. Period. At Rimrock Draw, this ash layer was intact. No breaks, no mixing, no contamination. Ogie's team could feel the texture change as their tools moved through it. Fine, powdery, unmistakable to anyone who's handled Tifra before. Music, it was a locked door between the past and everything above it. And beneath that door, O'Grady's team pulled out teeth and jaw fragments belonging to Camelops, an extinct giant camel that stood nearly 7 foot tall at the shoulder, a snorts species that vanished from North America thousands of years before humans were supposed to be anywhere near Oregon. First began excavating Rimrock Draw rock shelter in Burns, Oregon in 2011, which means this is among the oldest artifacts in North America. The tooth enamel was dense, surprisingly well preserved. The kind of find that makes you hold your breath because you know what it means before the lab confirms it. Now, pay attention to this part. The remains, weren't scattered the way a natural death leaves bones. Camels have been around a very long time, and they evolved here in America. We don't think of camels normally. We think of the Middle East when we think of camels. They weren't gnawed and dragged by predators. They were clustered, tight, deliberate in the pattern you see when an animal has been processed, butchered. And the bones carried cut marks, not shallow scratches, not vague abrasion, straight repeated incisions at the joints where meat separates from bone. The exact signature left by stone tools in human hands. No carnivore tooth, no trampling, no erosion produces those marks. Nothing does except a person holding a blade. That alone was a crisis for the old model, a giant camel, butchered by humans, sealed beneath ash that predates the Clovis timeline by thousands of years. But here's where it gets really uncomfortable. Thomas W. Stafford Jr. of Stafford Research and John Sun of the University of California, Irvine, ran radiocarbon dating on the tooth enamel. The first result came back in 2018. Stafford looked at the number and didn't publish it. He ran it again. The date was too old, too clean, too perfect. In the world of radiocarbon dating, a result this far outside the expected range doesn't just raise eyebrows, it raises the possibility that something went wrong in the lab. So Stafford waited. He tested again in 2023 with fresh samples. The second round confirmed it 18,250 years before present. Same number, same verdict. The lab hadn't made a mistake. The timeline had. When O'Grady received that confirmation, he didn't celebrate. He later told OPB that the team's first reaction was stunned silence, not excitement, silence. Charcoal chunks in the screen, and you could see the fire marks on the rock. And it was just so cool to just see that in person and to have a hand in excavating it to help catalog that. The kind that fills a room when everyone realizes at the same time that the ground rules just changed and nobody's ready for what comes next. The number was 5,000 years older than anything the Clovis model could accommodate. And unlike debatable estimates or controversial methods, this date was locked in by converging evidence. The volcanic ash seal, the undisturbed stratigraphy, and now 2 independent rounds of radiocarbon confirmation. For the old timeline to survive, every single one of those systems would have to be wrong simultaneously. The species identification, the cut marks, the ash dating, the radiocarbon analysis, the sediment integrity, all of them at once. The Clovis first theory took its first direct hit. But the real knockout was still underground in the tools and the blood still trapped inside them. Before we get to the evidence that sealed this case permanently, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Because what these tools contain changes everything about what we thought early humans were capable of. And this is the part most people have never heard. The tools and the blood inside them. After the camel tooth, the question hanging over Rimrock Draw was simple. Can you prove humans actually did this? Bones with cut marks suggested. But the field needed more. It needed the instruments, and it needed biological proof that those instruments touched animal flesh. It got both. The stone tools found alongside and beneath the camel remains were scrapers, carefully shaped with intentionally flaked cutting edges that no natural process can replicate. The form was consistent from tool to tool. These weren't rocks cracked by pressure or frost. They were designed, finished, purpose-built. And this is the detail nobody talks about. The scrapers were made from orange agate, a fine-grained stone with a distinctive warm color and glassy fracture that is immediately recognizable to anyone who works with lithic materials. And it does not exist anywhere near Rimrock Draw. The local geology is basalt and volcanic sediment. Dark, rough, completely different. No match in color, texture, or fracture pattern. That agate had to come from somewhere else. Carried in by hand over significant distance, possibly dozens of miles across Ice Age terrain. Either these people traveled far to source their preferred tool material, or they were connected to exchange networks reaching beyond the immediate region. We found camel tooth fragments. And below that, we found a really pretty orange egg scraper/knife multitool. Either way, this is not what desperate survival looks like. This is planning, organization, material preference. The kind of behavior that implies a culture, not just a presence. Under magnification, the edges of the tools showed where patterns that only formed through repeated cutting of meat and hide, smooth surfaces, and micro-fractures along predictable stress lines. These patterns match experimental results from modern replica tools used in controlled butchering studies. The Rimrock Draw scrapers weren't made and tossed. They were used hard again and again. But here's the deal. One scraper sat in a sediment layer deeper than the camel tooth itself. Deeper means older. The layers were clean and undisturbed. No burrowing, no water displacement, no mixing. That tool was placed there before the camel was killed, before 18,250 years ago. Let that land for a second. And then came the evidence no one could argue with. Scientists selected the scrapers for protein residue analysis, a method that detects microscopic traces of animal material forced into cracks in the stone during cutting. These proteins get trapped permanently. They cannot enter through groundwater, wind, or sediment. The only way they get inside the stone is by direct contact with fresh tissue. The tools were cleaned, tested under laboratory conditions, and the results came back specific. The residue matched the blood proteins of Bison antiquus, a massive Ice Age species significantly larger and more dangerous than any modern bison that went extinct thousands of years ago. And get this, that's not modern bison. Not a close relative. The protein signature was unmistakable. Someone held that stone tool and used it to cut into the carcass of an animal that hasn't walked this continent in millennia. There is no natural process that explains ancient bison proteins embedded in the fractures of a handworked stone scraper. None. This locked three elements into the same moment. The tools, the animals, and the humans who used one on the other. All that adds up to we've got cultural material. People made material from older than 15,000 years ago. Not spatially associated, biologically connected at a molecular level. Processing bison when antiquus was not small game scavenging. It required coordination, planning, and physical courage. This was organized big game activity happening in Central Oregon at least 18,000 years ago in a place and a time that the Clovis model said were empty. Another direct hit. And this one drew blood of its own. But if the evidence at this depth was already this damning, what about the layers below? The deeper you go, the worse it gets. This is the part that keeps archaeologists up at night, and it should keep you up too, The camel tooth, music, the one that came back at 18,250 years, was not found at the bottom of the excavation. It wasn't even close. Beneath it lie deeper sediment layers that O'Grady's team has only partially exposed, and those layers are not empty. Stone flakes and debris have already been identified in these deeper deposits. They show the same patterns as the tools found with the camel. Deliberate shaping, consistent form, characteristics that don't appear without human hands involved. No radiocarbon dates have been run on this material yet. But in undisturbed sediment, and rimrock draws stratigraphy is among the cleanest ever documented at a site this old, depth equals age. That is not a theory. It is a foundational law of geology. Anything below the camel tooth is older than 18,250 years. The only question is how much older? Now, think about this. When O'Grady described the sequence to music reporters, he didn't lead with the camel date. He said the stone tools and flakes found below the dated layers were what made the findings even more startling. The date was a shock. What sat beneath it was vertigo. Because those deeper tools aren't sitting just a few centimeters below the camel tooth. They extend down through additional layers of sediment. Each one representing centuries, maybe millennia of accumulation. The implication isn't that humans arrived a few hundred years earlier than the tooth suggests. It's that they may have been here for a period of time so long that the 18,000-year date is closer to the end of music, the story, than the beginning. It's hard to picture today, but this area used to have a Class 3 rapids running right through it with all the plants and trees that live in and around a riparian area. Here's where it gets wild. Excavation has not reached the bottom of the shelter, not even close. Funding limitations have slowed the work. Preservation concerns have forced the team to move carefully. Every layer at this depth is fragile, irreplaceable, and potentially more significant than the one above it. O'Grady has described sitting on the terrace across from the shelter, looking at the exposed sediment wall, knowing that what's below his feet could contain the oldest evidence of human activity ever found in North America, and not being able to reach it. Yet, the deposits keep going and nobody knows how far down they extend. Let that sink in. The evidence that already exists, the camel tooth, the tools, the blood residue, the volcanic ash seal, that evidence dates human presence in Oregon to at least 18,000 years ago, and has already shattered the Clovis first model beyond repair. But it may not represent the beginning of human occupation here. It may represent the middle or even a late chapter. We could be looking at 20,000 years, 22,000. Archaeologists and students at the University of Oregon have discovered new evidence suggesting that Oregon could be the oldest site of human occupation in North America. There's no way to know until those layers are opened. And this is where the Clovis timeline doesn't just crack, music, it collapses entirely. At 18,250 years ago, North America was locked in the last glacial maximum. The Laurentide ice sheet smothered most of Canada. The Cordilleran ice sheet blocked the western interior. The ice-free corridor between them, the one the Clovis model depends on, did not exist. Geological data confirms this across dozens of independent studies. You cannot walk through a passage that hasn't opened yet. Full stop. So, how did people get here? The only explanation that survives is the Kelp Highway, the Pacific coastal route first described by University of Oregon anthropologist John Aronson. Even during peak glacial conditions, kelp forests along the Pacific shoreline created a continuous corridor of marine resources: fish, shellfish, marine mammals, seabirds, music, edible seaweeds, running from Northeast Asia all the way to South America. Coastal travelers and watercraft could have followed this biological highway south, never needing to set foot on ice. The archaeological evidence is building. Pre-Clovis sites in the Channel Islands off California, in coastal Chile at Monte Verde, and now deep inland in Oregon. All pointing to people who arrived by water, not by land. The rimrock draw evidence fits this picture. Precisely. Imported tool materials, repeated site use, organized behavior across harsh conditions. These were not lost wanderers. These were navigators, people with boats, knowledge, and a coastal tradition that predates anything the old model imagined. But here's the deal. If the deeper layers push the dates back to 20,000 years or beyond, even the Kelp Highway model will need revision. The entire framework for understanding when, music, and how humans reached this continent is sitting on a fault line. And every centimeter of sediment Oge's team removes could trigger another collapse. The more the team finds, the more the evidence connects those ancient people to the present-day Northern Paiute tribe in eastern Oregon. Heather Ulrich, BLM Oregon, and Washington's archaeology lead stood at the edge of the excavation when the deeper layers were first exposed. According to colleagues present that day, she was quiet for a long time before music speaking. When she finally did, she called it one of the most exciting developments for the archaeological community. But the weight in her voice said something more. These weren't exciting layers. They were terrifying ones because they meant the story wasn't over. It was barely starting. And then there's David Lewis. Lewis is an anthropologist at Oregon State University, and he pointed out something that almost no mainstream coverage is mentioned. The dates emerging from rimrock draw a line with the oral histories of tribal nations in the region. Many of these nations carry stories about witnessing the Missoula floods, catastrophic events that reshaped the Pacific Northwest between 18,000 and 15,000 years ago. When Lewis connected those oral traditions to the archaeological evidence, the implication was staggering. These aren't myths. They may be memories, music, passed down across 800 generations. And rimrock draw may be the physical proof that those memories are real. If the deeper layers confirm what their position suggests, and right now, nothing indicates they won't, then the camel tooth won't be the beginning of this story. Music, it will be the middle. The opening chapter is still buried and it's waiting. Why nothing is settled anymore. Here's what rimrock draw makes undeniable. Humans were in North America far earlier than anyone in mainstream archaeology accepted for nearly a century. Not as a theory, not as a possibility, as measured, dated, biologically confirmed fact. Camel remains with human cut marks, stone tools made from imported material, microscopic blood residue from an extinct species, all sealed beneath volcanic ash with a known geological date. All sitting in undisturbed sediment that obeys every rule of stratigraphy. The Clovis first model, the theory that shaped American archaeology for generations, cannot accommodate this evidence. Something to hold a tool that was held by man over 16,000 years ago. Its timeline is too short. Its migration route didn't exist when these people were already here. Its assumptions about human capability were too narrow. Rimrock draw didn't chip away at the theory. It gutted it. And the consequences reach far beyond one rock shelter in Oregon. If people were living here more than 18,000 years ago, then other regions were almost certainly occupied too. Sites dismissed for decades, mountain shelters, volcanic zones, interior basins, coastal caves now submerged by rising seas, may hold evidence that was ignored because it didn't fit the old framework. Every site that was written off as too old to matter now matters. Every layer that was left unexcavated because the dates seemed impossible now needs a second look. But here's the part that should bother you the most. The bottom of rimrock draw has not been reached. The full depth of human occupation at this single site remains unknown. What has already been confirmed is enough to rewrite textbooks. What remains underground could rewrite them again. The people who lived at rimrock draw were not primitive refugees stumbling through an ice age. They crafted specialized tools from stone they carried across long distances. They hunted and processed animals that outweighed them by a factor of 10. They returned to the same shelter across centuries, possibly millennia, navigating seasons and conditions that would challenge modern survival equipment. They knew this landscape. They moved through it with purpose. And they did it during a period when 2-mile-thick ice sheets covered most of the continent. And the accepted story says no one was here at all. Imagine standing inside that shelter. The wind, blocked by the basalt overhang, the desert stretching silent in every direction. And beneath your feet, layer after layer of evidence that someone stood in this exact spot 20,000 years ago, holding a stone blade, preparing food, surviving another day in a world we barely understand. That's not academic. That's personal. That's human. So, here's the question I want you to sit with. And I want you to drop your answer in the comments. If one shallow rock shelter in the Oregon desert that nobody expected to matter just erased a century of accepted science, how confident should we be in anything the textbooks still say about the first Americans? Are we 20 years away from finding a site that pushes it back to 30,000, 50,000? Or has that site already been found and dismissed because it didn't fit the old story? Subscribe because this is not over. The ground is still talking. And the deeper we listen, the more everything changes.